everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming to our program today. Today we're going to have what we think is a very interesting and important discussion about the first ever Chicago elected school board election that's coming up this November the 5th. Statistics are showing us that not enough people know about it, and it's so critical to everything about our community's health that we thought we needed to talk about it today. The sponsor is Chicago Women Take Action, and that is an activist group of diverse women who have been active for 10 years or more, and who make sure that the programs, the programs like this that will be of interest to you are seen. We have some excellent, informative guests today that we're going to talk with. One is WBEZ's Kate Grossman, who will talk with us about some of the things that they have been doing for several months to prepare people for such a program. And we also have Valerie Leonard, pardon me, Valerie, who has been an activist for many, many years, and a friend of mine who I've seen do some excellent work. Her organization is, say it for me, Valerie.
Yeah, Illinois African Americans for Equitable Redistricting. I know that's a lot.
Yes.
So we just say IAFR.
IAFR.
Yes,
Illinois African American for Equitable Redistribution.
Redistricting.
Redistricting, right.
IAFR.
IAFR, right. And you have been involved most specifically in this past preparation for the elections that we're going to be talking about today. You have been for a year hard at work in dealing with the issues having to do with the maps, for example.
Yes.
Okay, well, so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk in two different directions. First, we're going to inform everybody about some of the particulars about the elections. What's the who, what, where, when, and most of all, why we're interested in this election being what it is. And then after we explore that, we're going to talk about some of the major issues that the people that we're electing and you citizens are going to have to deal with. So why don't we begin? Let me begin with you, Kate, by talking about giving us an overview of what the election's all about. How did it come about? What's some of the background and history, and what are the things that you want the public to know?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I think this is really fabulous because, as you mentioned, this is the first school board election ever in Chicago. The city of Chicago is the only school district that does not have an elected school board. It has never had an elected school board. So this is brand new for the city and for all the voters here. So nobody knows what's going on, really. So we have a huge hill to climb in terms of educating people. So the very short history is that, like I said, we've never had an elected school board in Chicago. We've always had some variation of an appointed school board. It's done different ways, but basically an appointed school board. For the last almost 30 years, the school board has been appointed by the mayor. Chicago was one of the first school districts in the country to start this movement of mayoral appointed school boards. So in the last, I would say, 20, 15 years or so, there's been a growing movement to move away from that, to have more direct representation, to have direct representation on the school board. A feeling that people are disenfranchised, that the board itself does not at all represent the people who send their children to the school district, who work in the school district, who graduated from the school district, all these things. And it was prompted by many of the policies that were implemented by the board, most prominently by an effort to close down a lot of schools and reopen them. There's a big teacher strike in 2012. That was the first teacher strike in 25 years. And then a real turning point was in 2013 when Chicago Public Schools closed down 50 schools. The board itself, voted to affirm the school system's decision to close the schools.
To that point, I mean, that one of the things that you're talking about now, I want the audience to really know that I've seen some excellent articles that you have published at your station, and that they can take a look at and get more of the history and background. So go on, though, in terms of what that has done for the public, in terms of the public's positioning about wanting a school board.
So it's really created an appetite, a very strong appetite for representation.
Yes.
And it was sort of a, out of left field idea for a long time, and it really gained steam over the last many years. And fast forward, eventually it got to Springfield. Well, there was always interest in Springfield, but it was never even taken up for a vote.
Right.
Eventually it was taken up for a vote, and it passed. I mean, I'm fast forwarding through a lot of history, but it passed. And
when they got a Democratic governor.
Right, a Democratic governor, and so that's where we are. But it's all new, and it's not without controversy. I mean, we've looked a lot at the research. There isn't a lot of research to suggest that the school board, the governance structure of a school board, has much influence on student achievement, for example, which is one of the most important things, right? We want the kids to succeed and to do well academically and get a good education. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that whether you have an elected board or an appointed board, that it influences the outcomes.
What were some of the controversies, though, that we want to hone in on? For example, Valerie, I believe that a lot of your work centered around how the elections were supposed to be structured. That is, the districts. How many districts are there? Explain to the audience how it's structured and what your issues were with regard to the map.
It's structured in a very convoluted way, as the folks in Springfield will remember my saying, but to make a long story short, there are 20 districts, 20 sub-districts, 10 districts that are comprised of 2 sub-districts. So there will be elections for 10 districts, and you have sub-district A, sub-district B for each of those 10, and the people who are running are going to be running to represent the 10, right?
So there are
right. So, but 20 sub-districts. So if you win and you happen to live in sub-district A, then the mayor gets to choose the person from sub-district B.
Okay, so in other words, the people are going to elect 10 new districts, and the mayor is going to appoint in 10 or 11 in this case, because he's going to appoint the school board president, right?
Yes.
So there's 21 people that are being actually a part of this new board, as opposed to 7 board members, as I've understood it. So we've got a really bigger board, and we've got the complexity of us electing half of the board right now, and keeping our eye on who the mayor's electing. Okay, right. So are there any other nuances that within that structure that you want to
I think also just for voters, I think it's just to be clear, you just need to find out what district you live in, or district 1 through 10,
right?
And you vote just in that district. So if you live in District 2, you find out there are 3 candidates. You find out what the names of your candidates are. You do some research. You cast 1 ballot in 1 district. As a voter, that's really all you need to know. Well, most important. I mean, in the essence, that's what you need to know. You're casting 1 vote in your district.
All right.
Who's going to represent you and your larger community on the school board?
Where will people get the information about who's running and how many people are running?
Great question. So WBEZ and the Chicago Sun-Times and Chalkbeat Chicago, which is a nonprofit education news organization, we have teamed up to do a voter guide, which is coming out later this month. It's going to be both online and print, and it's very comprehensive. The essence of it is questionnaire. We have questionnaires back from pretty much every candidate. There are 31 candidates across the 10 districts. So we have 16 questions, all their views on everything, on school choice, on standardized testing, on how to improve achievement, et cetera, plus biographical information. So you can just get to know them, who they are. We even asked some fun questions, like, what, you know, how would your elementary school teacher describe you? Like, what, you know, just so we can get a little bit to know them a little bit. So that'll be available. Plus we have maps of all the districts that where you can put your address in and you find, oh, okay, I'm in District 7, you find out where you are. We also have a campaign donation tracker because money is very important, as in every election. There's no campaign donation limits specific to this.
What's the meaning of there being no campaign donation limits?
So that means you can donate as much as you want. I mean, there are limits in Illinois, but there's no specific limits for the elected school board race.
So the consequences of that would be what?
There can be a lot of money flowing in.
Okay.
I mean, and so far, I checked just before we came, I think it's a little over $500,000 already have been donated to all 31 candidates, but it's pretty early days. Usually right after Labor Day is when an election really starts to heat up, and I think that number is going to really start to grow exponentially.
Okay.
So we have a tracker so you can see where all the money's coming from and who's getting it and who's not getting it. So anyway, that's all collected in one place.
Good.
Yeah.
And so you'll have this voter guide ready when?
Later this month, in 2 weeks.
Okay, at your site.
Yeah, at wbez.org.
All right. Are there other, Valerie? Are there other voter guides? I think you had talked about other voter guides you were also aware of, and these are nonpartisan.
Correct.
Voter guides. They're people that are not, by definition, not trying to get you to vote for a particular person, just to get you in education. Are there others?
Yeah, I'm aware of COAL, that is the Coalition of African American Leaders, and that is a group of people, you know, from business, education, you know, various sectors. And we have been working together. We pulled together a questionnaire. I think there are about 25 questions on a number of issues. And what was driving us is, you know, what is it that we as individuals representing, you know, communities all around the city, what is it that we would be looking for in a candidate? Do these people have qualifications? And when we say qualifications, we're not necessarily looking at what the Constitution says, you know, you have to be what age of a majority, blah, blah, blah. We're looking at people who have skills, you know, governance skills, you know, skills in finance, knowledge of the community, knowledge of the legislation and how that might impact others. And then we're also looking at it holistically because we realize that folks, you know, they may represent one district, but the decisions they make impact the whole city. And, you know, that really should happen, you know, in city council. It doesn't always happen that way, but we believe there'll be a better chance of that here. So what Cole has done is, you know, again, we're working on a website and it'll be very similar, I guess, in some ways. You know, we'll have pictures of each of the candidates. We'll have a map of the districts and pinpoint where the candidates live, so you can understand immediately whether there are some areas that are not going to be represented in an election, if that's true. We have the bios and links to their, you know, to their campaign website.
Good. So in addition to into those resources, and I've understood that there are a couple of others that are being prepared as well that we can take a look at. Talk about the whole idea of looking at and what the responsibilities of these of the elected officials will be, so that, as you mentioned, your criteria is that they be able to, for example, be fiscally sound and no operations and so forth. Are there other things that you would like to make sure that the public knows about responsibilities that they might have?
I mean, well, the board has a lot of major responsibilities. I mean, they have many. Their main one is they pass the budget every year.
Right.
So, you know, Valerie is right on when she says they should have fiscal know-how to read a budget, to evaluate a budget. So that's a crucial element of what a board member does. But they have a board meeting every month where they pass all kinds of different policies around curriculum, around after-school programming, around admissions policies, or everything you can imagine affecting the operations of a school system, about contracts for maintenance workers, for everything. So you should have some understanding of contracting, about education policy, about curriculum. I mean, you don't have to be an expert on all of these things, but it's you shouldn't just be sort of a feel good, I want to make the school system better person. I mean, you need to bring some skills in operations, in curriculum, in how to run a school system, and obviously in budgeting to be successful.
Yeah. Now, within the context of what and how this thing got structured, there was a huge fight about the mapping. And that mapping fight revolved around discussions concerning the racial makeup of the city and the racial makeup of the school system. To explain a little bit more about that, because you were deeply involved in that aspect of it. To explain what it was and then what the outcome was.
Okay. When you look at the makeup of the city, it's roughly approximately a third Black, approximately a third Latino, approximately a third white. And we say a third, but just say 30%, and then 10% would be Asian and others. So there is one school of thought that says, well, equitably, we need to make sure that our board reflects the composition of the students who use the system. However, when you look at the Constitution, look at things legally, you don't go by the makeup of the schools. You need to go by the makeup of the district, right? So whether or not white kids are actually using this asset, their parents are paying taxes, right?
Okay.
You need to be equitable to every voter, and not so much taxpayer, but the Constitution follows the voter. So you need one man, one vote. So if you were to develop a map that was reflective of the racial makeup of the school, you would really be open, and I'm sorry for digging in the weeds like this, but you would really be leaving yourself open as a municipality to all kinds of lawsuits, because that's just unconstitutional.
Because I think because the school system itself is almost 90% kids of color, right? Which is not representative of the city as a whole, right?
That's correct.
Right. So
Okay, good. So what was the outcome of that issue?
All right, I can tell you one perspective. Our proposal was to actually use ward boundaries and then cluster five districts within each of the boundaries, and that would satisfy Voting Rights Act as well as other constitutional requirements, and it would also reflect the racial makeup of the city. What actually happened was somewhat of a compromise. The people who were driving the mapping process, and I'll say CTU and labor, they wanted to have a process where there was no semblance of any existing political boundary. They wanted something that was new, so to speak, and they wanted something that would also pass muster. So what we ended up with is 10 districts that are subdivided. We ended up with what we have, and it does pass muster constitutionally, but as you heard me describe it, it could be very, very confusing and convoluted.
Well, at the end of the day, I believe that I've understood that one of the compromises that you all actually arrived at was something that was cabinet level, representing the students, the African American students, who, as I've understood from what your positions have been, are very, very disenfranchised because of their literal positions as being so academically difficult, in a difficult place.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk about a little bit about that and what that compromise was?
Yeah, so our proposal included our map, which went nowhere. But we were very, very happy that the other part of our proposal, which was the Black Student Achievement Committee, was passed. And what that did was make sure that we elevate the issues impacting Black children specifically, not Black and brown, not minority, but Black children specifically, because Black children, regardless of which major group you're looking at, for whatever reason, they continue to lag behind everyone else. Immigrant children, white children, Asian children, Latino children. And it seemed to us that nobody was really paying attention. Nobody was prioritizing it. When we were going through this process, we heard there was legislation for a non-citizens advisory board. The mayor was elected in April, and he took office in May, and within less than 2 months, he had a fully staffed special needs board level accountability, and there was still nothing for our children. So we felt it very, very necessary to advocate for a law that would prioritize Black children. So what does that mean? Create an evidence-based process, strategic planning process, where you're looking at data, so you're not just guessing what the problem is, and we all quote unquote know the problem, but do we really know the magnitude of the problem? So going where the data would take us, and then based on that, identify the issues, identify strategies that are proven to work, and then actually do your plan and monitor the progress on a very regular basis. So that, in a nutshell, was the law. So in addition to creating the strategic management process that's monitored regularly, they also are responsible for helping to set policy. So we were really, really, really happy to know that that was actually put into law. It's a standing committee and not an advisory board. So when we say standing, that means it's a regular committee of the board. It has responsibility directly to the board. It's not like they make recommendations and the board can say, that sounds nice, and never move on it. They're obligated, right? Because it's a standing committee, just like the finance committee, just like the personnel committee. Those are standing committees.
Is it funded?
No, it's not funded. So we got an unfunded mandate.
Thank you. Kay, would you, because I've read some things in the articles that you've discussed this very issue in terms of the statistical analysis as to why African American children should be singled out as needing this kind of special focus. Can you enlighten us a little bit about what some of the things that Sarah Karp and others have written about that? There's lots of reasons.
I think the most prominent is there's a long history, and this is one of the reasons why there was strong motivation to try an elected school board, is that, in Chicago, we all know we have a very segregated city, and a lot of, historically and up to current times, of course, a lot of the schools in Chicago's Black neighborhoods have been disinvested. They're under-enrolled, and they have been stripped of a lot of programming. They often have trouble recruiting teachers, so there's high teacher turnover. They often have younger teachers, less experienced teachers. They often have, Sarah Karp, our Chicago Public Schools reporter, has done lots of stories about, long-term substitutes or substitutes just sort of circulating because they can't find a permanent teacher. I mean, it's like you have a first grader learning to read and they don't have a regular teacher. I mean, the damage that causes. Yes. So when you don't have properly resourced schools, and then you often have communities that have high needs, right? I mean, research shows us, and common sense tells us that communities that have high needs need more investment, right? Extra equity, right? Yes. And so instead, what we found is that that they often have less, and so that is one of the primary drivers of why, we see these achievement gaps.
Yes. Well, this is a perfect segue to start to talk about some of the prominent issues that the school board will be dealing with and that the community is very interested in them dealing with. And the first one that comes to mind has to do with the school choice issue. The idea of specialized schools, magnet schools, gifted schools, and so forth, that have a certain level of funding and a certain level of resources going there, as opposed to some of the community's concerns about equitably funding and resourcing all of the schools. Can you talk about some of the things that you have published about that issue?
Sure, and it's partly a funding issue, but it's actually not so much a funding issue. It's about the sort of the culture and the desirability of some schools versus others. Because I mean funding, just put that aside for a minute, because sometimes these schools are better funded, but sometimes they're not. It's just that basically, Chicago used to be, most kids just went to their neighborhood school for high school and elementary school. And over the last, a couple decades, it has shifted almost exclusively in high school to what's called a choice school system. So about 75% of our high schoolers do not go to their assigned neighborhood high school. They go outside, they go elsewhere.
Right.
So it's choice. They go to a Tustin high school, they go to a charter high school, they could even go to another neighborhood high school, but that's outside their community. I don't know the elementary school stat, but it's lower, but there's also a lot of choice in the neighborhoods. And so, and this is part of what I was referring to before when I was talking about the equity issue. As we became a choice school district, particularly with charter schools, because there were a lot of struggling neighborhood schools, one of the solutions was, okay, let's open a lot of charter schools to try something better. And it was done without a lot of thought. And so a community that didn't have a robust population would get 2 new charter schools, and there weren't enough kids, basically, and then it would just drain the kids away from the neighborhood school, because everyone's like, oh, there's this new shiny thing down the street, I'll try that.
Yeah.
And then the neighborhood school really suffered because the dollars follow the kid. So anyway, this is all to say, so with Mayor Johnson, when he was elected, he really wants to emphasize rebuilding neighborhood schools. Yeah. And so the board, led by the mayor, I can't remember exactly what they did, but they instituted a policy statement basically saying, like, we want to prioritize neighborhood schools and to try to reverse some of the damage done by the choice system. And so they haven't actually done anything really. I mean, they've done some things. That's not to say.
They stirred up the pot.
They stirred up the pot hardcore. They have done some things.
And what's the reaction been from the community? I think you've got a survey, and your community is very interested in that issue, right? What's happening?
Well, I can tell you, as someone who graduated from a magnet school, when I read that there was going to be a de-emphasis on magnet schools and then have us focus on neighborhood schools, I think on the surface that sounds wonderful, but I'm thinking I don't want anybody to take away resources from my school, right? So I'm protective that way. But then I also look at Chicago and our racist history. We've always had neighborhood schools, and the schools in the white neighborhoods were better resourced in the black neighborhoods. If we're not careful, we're going to end up resegregating our schools. And the reason why we have magnet schools in the first place is because of the need to desegregate. So I don't want us to end up in a position where we're favoring one over the other. I try to look at our schools as more or less an ecosystem. And I guess I'm also very idealistic, in case you didn't know. People will call me Pollyanna. But I think ideally you want an ecosystem where you're not cannibalizing one type of school or one neighborhood in favor of another. If you have a large corporation, corporations have divisions, right? And if you got a good leader, He's not going to take from division A, B, C to put in X, Y, Z. He's going to make sure that everybody is operating at optimal level. And I think that's what we need to do with our schools. I think that we need to, and I'm even concerned about the language that we use in terms of choice, right, versus neighborhood schools, because even our language, I think, covers up, a lot of stuff that is underneath the surface. But, so I'm not going to say I'm pro-choice or pro-neighborhood school. I just want to make sure that every school is adequately resourced so that, everybody can coexist based on the needs of the children.
So Kay, in your survey, what did the public say about that, how they felt about school choice and equity and so forth? What did the surveys reveal?
Well, so we surveyed CPS parents, and I mean, I think and we also, we worked with a public survey organization, and I think views are very mixed because people, I think they feel often how you do, that nobody wants to hurt something else. They want all the schools to be robust, right? And so, but also they don't. When it comes down to it, if you're a parent, you want what's best for your kid.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting in particular that choice is actually used most often in neighborhoods that don't have quality schools. And that's often in poor Black neighborhoods. So that's because they need the choice.
Right.
But it's so.
And it's loaded because usually choice is synonymous with pro-charter, and it really should, it should not be.
It's about choice really just means parents trying to figure out what the best thing is for their kid. But I think, so I think parents are very torn about this. But this pot that they stirred up has really stirred up a lot because people are freaking out, particularly about the selective enrollment schools, which are, there's several of them are, extremely high performing, among the best. They are the best in the state, and some of them are the best among the best in the country. And people, I think, in some ways, a lot of ways, misinterpreted and thought, oh, this means they're going to close them down, which is, they never said that, and they have since been very clear. They being the board and the mayor, we're not going to close these schools down.
Talk about some of the policy issues that really are roiling that issue about selective enrollment, though, in the selective enrollment schools. We talked earlier about the fact that people have to test in, and indeed that the way that works from a policy point of view kind of skews the issue.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the basic issue is that there's just not enough schools in Chicago that are really high quality. I think that's the basic issue. And so these schools are extremely highly sought after. There's just lots of kids want to go, and of course there's only a handful of them. There's not enough seats. And what we have seen over time is that fewer Black kids are going to these schools. They've gotten a little bit less low income, so more higher income kids are going to them. And so, nobody wants that, right? We want these schools to represent our city. So that's problematic, and that's something that the board and the mayor are contemplating now, making some changes in the admissions policies to try to make these schools, these selective schools, more representative of the city.
So the issue of that would be one of the things that you might want to evaluate a commissioner about his views or her views on that issue. That leads directly then into the questions about this roiling right now about the budget. We have a budget that is $9.9 billion with a B, and we are $500 million deficit as we speak, and this is before the decisions about the Chicago Teachers Union raises. So where are we in terms of the understanding how that budget works and how that budget might be something that applies to this, evaluating what we want the board to do?
And when you say we, you're talking about the candidates or we, the community?
The community, from your perspective, what are the budget considerations that you would want to be seen in terms of how the budget some of the budget problems
Right.
are handled.
Yeah, I would like to see, well, first and foremost, given that we put so much into the Black Student Success Plan at the operating level, that's under Pedro. I'm sorry for being so familiar. Under Pedro Martinez, right? We put a lot of time into that. We also put even more effort behind getting the legislation done for the Black Student Achievement. But as you asked me before, is it funded? No, it's not funded. Neither one of those initiatives is funded. When I hear the discussions, going back and forth, and as I mentioned before, on both sides, every other thing boils up to be a priority, but I have not, in a whole year's time, heard anybody from either side of the negotiating table. And when I say negotiating table, I'm looking at the teachers versus the administration. They go to Springfield for all these other things that they want to get funded, but we don't hear a peep about funding for that. So that's not the only thing, but I think we really do need to get funding, have a dedicated line item just for the implementation of those plans.
Okay, Kay, what are some of the things that you would point out are some of the problems that they're going to be wrestling with in this budget that you want to point out to the audience?
Well, I think everything we've talked about is the reason you cannibalize from one school to the other is because you don't have enough money. You have to choose. So we have a historically, chronically underfunded school system. And the last couple years, we've been buoyed by federal COVID relief money.
Oh, great point.
And this year is the last year, and we have a much smaller pot this year, and it is running out. And so this year they predicted a $500 million deficit, which they closed. They did pass a budget that was balanced,
in quotes.
But a new deficit will emerge because they have to settle the teacher's contract and they have this outstanding pension issue. And then for the next 5 years, they've already projected $500 million deficits in each of the next 5 years. So in terms of evaluating candidates, I think people should really think about that question.
Right.
So do they want someone who they think is going to be able to find money in Springfield or Washington? Do they want someone who says, I wish there was money in Springfield and Washington, but it's not going to happen, so I want someone who's going to be tightening the belt and doing it that way? I think those are the questions a voter should think about in terms of who they want on the board.
Excellent.
And then you and I were talking, the mayor has a unique position, right? He can see all of these budgets from the top down. He can look at the Park District budget, he can look at CPS's budget, the city budget, blah, blah, blah. Why not be creative and look at ways these different sister agencies can come together and support our schools? Because quite frankly, I think there's some things that they're negotiating that schools really ought not be in the business of doing. Why not look at the city's budget for social services or the Park District budget and see how these agencies can collaborate in support of the schools? That was part of our proposal.
Indeed, because we're wrapping up in terms of time, but I do want to emphasize that the idea was the mayor did actually say something to the effect that the after-school programs of this that the school once did, which has been cut, is indeed something that needs to be looked at in terms, and very well could fit into what you're talking about. Well, we are close to closing now without necessarily saying that we've seen all solutions, but we certainly have seen, and I believe that we have convinced people that this is a time that we really must pay attention to who we are going to elect in this very complex, very important election that is going to actually determine not just who goes to school, but what happens to our whole economic and social lives. Thank you for joining us, and we hope we'll see you at the polls.